Miss Marple and the Halloween Home Tour Tragedy. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm your host, William, and I'm delighted you've joined me tonight. Before we begin this evening's tale, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Now, settle into something comfortable, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, and let us begin our journey into the shadows of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. Cobwebs and candlelight through history's doors. The October evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar quality of anticipation that only Halloween can bring. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her sensible coat against the autumn chill and regarded the assembled crowd with her characteristic mild blue eyes. The village square was alive with excited children in costume, their parents clutching printed programs detailing the route of this year's Historic Homes Halloween tour. Her nephew Raymond's wife, Joan, was attempting to corral their two children, Emma and Timothy, who were dressed respectively as a witch and a rather enthusiastic vampire. Raymond himself stood nearby, consulting the program with the air of a man determined to extract maximum educational value from the evening's festivities. 5 historic homes, he announced to his small family group, spanning from the 16th century to the 1920s. Rather, a comprehensive overview of English domestic architecture, wouldn't you say, Aunt Jane? Miss Marple smiled gently. Indeed, my dear, though I suspect young Emma and Timothy are rather more interested in the treats than the architecture. The treats are meant to be period-appropriate, Joan interjected, reading from her own programme. The Tudor cottage is offering marchpane, the Georgian manor has sugared almonds, the Victorian rectory promises proper boiled sweets, the Edwardian townhouse has Turkish delight, and the 20s bungalow is distributing chocolate bars. Miss Marple found this attention to detail rather charming, though she privately wondered how many children would appreciate the historical significance of their confections. The tour had been organised by the St. Mary Mead Historical Society, and its president, Dr. Patricia Ashbourne, could be seen moving among the crowd with a clipboard, checking last-minute arrangements. Dr. Ashbourne was a woman of perhaps 55, with iron-grey hair pulled back severely and an expression of perpetual scholarly concentration. She wore a sensible tweed suit and carried herself with the authority of someone who had devoted decades to the study of local history. Miss Marple had encountered her occasionally at village functions and had formed the impression of a woman more comfortable with the past than the present. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and ghouls, Dr. Ashbourne's voice carried clearly across the square, and several children giggled at her attempt at Halloween humour. Welcome to the 10th annual Historic Homes Halloween tour. This evening, you'll have the opportunity to visit 5 remarkable properties, each representing a different period in our village's architectural heritage. She proceeded to outline the route they would follow, beginning with the 16th century honeysuckle cottage and progressing chronologically through the centuries. Each homeowner would provide a brief historical presentation before distributing treats, and participants were encouraged to ask questions. However, Dr. Ashbourne continued, her tone becoming more serious, I must remind everyone that these are private homes whose owners have generously opened their doors. Please treat each property with respect and remain with the tour group at all times. Miss Marple noticed something in the historian's expression as she said this, a tightness around the eyes that suggested recent stress. She filed this observation away in that remarkably organised mental cabinet, where she stored all manner of useful information about human nature. The tour began promptly at 6 o'clock, with the crowd of perhaps 40 people making their way along the high street to Honeysuckle Cottage. The property was indeed charming, its timber frame and wattle and daub construction clearly visible in the glow of carefully placed lanterns. The owner, Mrs. Daphne Hartley, an elderly widow with an eager manner, greeted them at the door. "Welcome to Honeysuckle Cottage," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "Built in 1592, this is one of the oldest surviving buildings in St. Mary Mead. Notice the original oak beams and the inglenook fireplace." As Mrs. Hartley continued her presentation, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to Dr. Ashbourne, who stood near the back of the group with her clipboard. The historian's expression had grown increasingly stern, and she was making notations with sharp, decisive movements of her pen. Raymond's son Timothy tugged at Miss Marple's sleeve. "Great Aunt Jane, what's marchpane?" "Marzipan, dear," she replied kindly. "A sweet made from almonds and sugar. Rather expensive in Tudor times, which is why it was considered a special treat." The tour progressed to the Georgian manor, Ashwood House, where the owner, Mr. Gerald Pemberton, a portly gentleman with an impressive handlebar moustache, held forth on Palladian architectural principles while distributing sugared almonds from a silver bowl. Here again, Miss Marple observed Dr. Ashbourne's critical scrutiny, followed by more emphatic note-taking. At the Edwardian townhouse, Magnolia Terrace, owned by the somewhat flamboyant Mrs. Sylvia Thornton, Miss Marple noticed actual tension developing. As Mrs. Thornton described her home's Art Nouveau decorative features, Dr. Ashbourne interrupted with a pointed question about the provenance of certain stained glass windows. Mrs. Thornton's response was notably evasive, and her smile became distinctly strained. By the time they reached the Victorian rectory at 7:30, owned by Mr. Timothy Wexford, the atmosphere had grown decidedly uncomfortable. Mr. Wexford was a tall, thin man in his early 40s, who ran a house clearance business. He had dressed for the occasion in elaborate Victorian gentleman's costume, complete with top hat and frock coat. "Welcome to Blackwood Rectory," he announced with theatrical flourish, "built in 1873 to house St. Mary Mead's vicar. Tonight, I shall demonstrate one of the most fascinating features of Victorian ecclesiastical architecture, a genuine priest hole dating from the building's Catholic origins." Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably. Priest holes were traditionally associated with the Elizabethan persecution of Catholics, not Victorian construction. She glanced at Dr. Ashbourne and saw the historian's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. What happened next would transform an educational Halloween tour into something far more sinister, and would require all of Miss Marple's considerable understanding of human nature to unravel. Chapter 2. The historian vanishes behind hidden walls. Mr. Wexford's Victorian rectory was an imposing structure of dark brick, with Gothic revival details that caught the flickering light of the jack-o'-lanterns placed strategically along the entrance path. The interior proved equally atmospheric, with heavy furniture and dark wallpaper that Miss Marple suspected owed more to theatrical effect than historical accuracy. "The priest hole," Mr. Wexford announced with evident pride, "is located in the study. If you'll all follow me, I shall demonstrate how these ingenious hiding places functioned." The group filed into a wood-panelled room lined with bookshelves. The children's excitement had begun to wane slightly after 3 previous houses, but the promise of a secret chamber revived their interest considerably. Timothy Marple pressed forward eagerly, his vampire cape billowing behind him. "Now then," Mr. Wexford continued, positioning himself beside a particular section of bookshelf, "priest holes were cunningly designed to be almost impossible to detect. The entrance mechanism was typically known only to the homeowner and perhaps a trusted servant." He reached behind a leather-bound volume and pressed something. With a satisfying click, a section of the panelling swung inward, revealing a dark cavity approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet deep. Dr. Ashbourne stepped forward, her scholarly interest apparently overcoming her earlier disapproval. "May I examine the mechanism more closely, Mr. Wexford? I'm particularly interested in dating the construction." Mr. Wexford's smile faltered momentarily. "Of course, Dr. Ashbourne, though I'm afraid the space is rather confined." "I've examined smaller priest holes," the historian replied crisply, producing a small torch from her handbag. "This won't take a moment." She crouched and manoeuvred herself into the opening with practised efficiency. Miss Marple, watching carefully, noted that Dr. Ashbourne's torch beam played systematically across the interior surfaces, and the historian's expression changed from professional interest to something more complex. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Mr. Wexford," Dr. Ashbourne's voice emerged from the priest hole. "Could you explain the presence of these items? They appear to be—" "I'm afraid we must keep to schedule," Mr. Wexford interrupted, his jovial manner becoming notably strained. "Perhaps you could complete your examination later? The children are getting rather restless." This was indeed true. Several of the younger participants were beginning to lose interest, and their parents were checking watches and making meaningful glances toward the door. Dr. Ashbourne emerged from the priest hole, her face flushed and her expression severe. She was clutching her research notebook and appeared to be about to speak when Joan touched Miss Marple's arm. "Aunt Jane, Emma says she's not feeling well. I think all the sweets are catching up with her. Would you mind terribly if we stepped outside for some fresh air?" "Not at all, my dear." Miss Marple followed her niece and the slightly green-looking Emma into the hallway. Through the study doorway she could see Dr. Ashbourne and Mr. Wexford engaged in what appeared to be a tense, whispered conversation. After tending to Emma, who recovered quickly once away from the stuffy rooms, Miss Marple found herself separated from the main group. The house was larger than she had initially realised, with several corridors branching off in different directions. She could hear the tour guide's voice from what sounded like the drawing room, where Mr. Wexford was presumably discussing Victorian domestic arrangements. It was then that she encountered Mrs. Hartley from Honeysuckle Cottage, looking somewhat flustered as she emerged from what appeared to be the cloakroom. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm so turned around in these old houses. They're like rabbits' warrens, aren't they? Have you seen Dr. Ashbourne? She and I were meant to discuss something about my cottage's timbers." "I'm afraid I haven't seen her since the priest hole demonstration." "How odd. She said she wanted to have another quick look at it before we moved on to the last house." Mrs. Hartley checked her watch. That was nearly 20 minutes ago. Miss Marple felt the first stirring of unease. 20 minutes was rather a long time for a quick examination, particularly with a scheduled tour to complete. They returned to the study, where the priest hole remained open, its dark cavity now looking somehow less welcoming than before. Miss Marple called softly into the opening. "Dr. Ashbourne, are you quite all right?" Silence greeted her inquiry. Mrs. Hartley peered anxiously over Miss Marple's shoulder. "Perhaps she found something so interesting she lost track of time. She does get rather absorbed in her research." Miss Marple, however, was not reassured. She borrowed Mrs. Hartley's torch and directed its beam into the priest hole. The small chamber appeared empty, but something caught the light from the floor, shards of glass that, upon closer examination, proved to be the remains of spectacles. "Mrs. Hartley, I think you should fetch Mr. Wexford immediately," Miss Marple said quietly. "And perhaps it would be wise to contact Inspector Slack." For there, just visible in the deeper shadows at the back of the priest hole, was something that should not have been there, a darker stain on the old stone floor, and the hem of a tweed skirt. Dr. Patricia Ashbourne had not left the priest hole at all. Chapter 3. Blood upon the Victorian Stones. The transformation of the Victorian rectory from festive tour venue to crime scene occurred with remarkable swiftness. Inspector Slack arrived within 15 minutes of Mrs. Hartley's breathless telephone call, bringing with him Dr. Haydock and Sergeant Lake. The remaining tour participants were gathered in the drawing room, their Halloween excitement replaced by shocked whispers and nervous speculation. Miss Marple remained in the study, positioned discreetly in a corner, where she could observe without interfering. She had long ago learned that policemen worked more efficiently when elderly ladies did not appear to be watching their every move, but that did not prevent her from watching nonetheless. Dr. Haydock emerged from the priest hole with a grave expression. "I'm afraid it's murder, Inspector. Dr. Ashbourne has been struck repeatedly about the head with a heavy object. Death would have been relatively quick." "The murder weapon?" Inspector Slack inquired, his notebook already open. "This, I believe." Dr. Haydock held up a Victorian chamber candlestick, its ornate brass base now darkly stained. "I found it inside the priest hole, beside the body. The dimensions are consistent with the injuries." Miss Marple studied the candlestick with interest. It was a substantial piece, perhaps 2 feet in height, with elaborate decorative work, the sort of object one might find in any Victorian household, or more relevantly, in any house clearance warehouse. Inspector Slack turned to Mr. Wexford, who had been standing near the bookshelf with the expression of a man experiencing a particularly vivid nightmare. "Mr. Wexford, I'll need to ask you some questions. When did you last see Dr. Ashbourne?" Wexford's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "During the priest hole demonstration. She went in to examine it, came out briefly, and then said she wanted another look. I was called away to deal with some question about the dining room, and when I returned to the study, the group had moved on. I assumed she'd caught up with them." "The priest hole was still open when you left?" "Yes, I always leave it open during tours. It's rather a point of pride, you see." "And yet," Sergeant Lake interjected, directing his torch beam at the mechanism, "it's closed now. More than closed, actually. It appears to be jammed." This observation sent a ripple of interest through the assembled officials. Inspector Slack moved closer to examine the mechanism himself. "Explain to me how this works, Mr. Wexford." The house clearance contractor approached the bookshelf with obvious reluctance. "The release catch is behind this particular volume, Fox's Book of Martyrs, rather appropriate for a priest hole. When pressed, it disengages a spring mechanism that allows the panel to swing inward. From inside, there's a corresponding release that allows occupants to exit." "Show me." Mr. Wexford reached behind the book and pressed. Nothing happened. He tried again with more force, and still the panel remained stubbornly closed. "I don't understand," he said, his face pale. "It's never failed before. I've demonstrated it dozens of times." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the edges of the panel, made a small sound of discovery. "Inspector, there appears to be something wedged into the mechanism here. Something metallic." Using a pair of tweezers from his medical bag, he carefully extracted a small circular object and held it up to the light. Miss Marple's excellent eyesight identified it immediately as a coin, specifically a modern penny of notably recent mintage. 2023, Sergeant Lake read from the date. Brand new by the look of it. This detail struck Miss Marple as highly significant. The priest hole mechanism was supposedly original to the house, yet it had been jammed with a coin less than a year old. Moreover, all the treats distributed during the tour had been individually wrapped. She had observed this herself. No loose change had been involved in any transaction. Inspector Slack's expression had grown increasingly stern. "Mr. Wexford, I'm going to need you to account for your movements between 7:35 and 7:50 this evening. That's when Dr. Ashbourne was last seen alive and when her body was discovered." "I was with the tour group in the drawing room discussing Victorian social customs. Several people can vouch for my presence." "The entire time?" Here Mr. Wexford hesitated, and Miss Marple noted the pause with considerable interest. "There may have been a brief period when I stepped into the hall to fetch more Turkish delight from the kitchen. Some of the children wanted seconds." "How brief?" "Perhaps 5 minutes, maybe slightly longer. The kitchen is at the far end of the house." Miss Marple quietly retrieved her small notebook from her handbag and made several notations. She had observed Mr. Wexford's candy bowl during their arrival in the drawing room, and it had certainly been well stocked. The need for replenishment seemed questionable. More significantly, she had been making careful note of the various homeowners' costumes throughout the evening. Mr. Wexford's elaborate Victorian gentleman's outfit had been immaculate upon their arrival at the rectory. Now, however, she observed something that had not been present before, a faint coating of dust on the knees of his trousers, visible when he knelt to demonstrate the priest hole mechanism. Not ordinary household dust, but something older and more distinctive. The kind of dust that accumulates over centuries in sealed spaces. The kind of dust one might acquire by kneeling or crawling in a 400-year-old priest hole. Chapter 4. A Gap in the Candy Distribution. Inspector Slack's interrogation of Mr. Wexford continued with methodical thoroughness, but Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the children who remained in the drawing room with their parents. Young Timothy Marple had recovered his enthusiasm and was comparing his collection of treats with those of other participants. "I got 3 chocolate bars from the last house," one boy was saying, "but I only got 1 piece of Turkish delight here because Mr. Wexford wasn't at his bowl when I came through." "Same with me," another child chimed in. "I had to wait ages for him to come back. My mum said he must have gone to the toilet." Miss Marple moved closer to the small group, smiling benignly. "What a wonderful collection of treats you've all gathered. Did everyone receive their Turkish delight in the end?" "Eventually," Timothy replied, "but Sarah and James said they didn't get any at all because they went through while Mr. Wexford was away, and their parents said they shouldn't take sweets without asking." "Very proper of them," Miss Marple observed. "And how long would you say Mr. Wexford was absent?" The children consulted among themselves with that particular sense of time that only the young possess. Finally, Timothy ventured, "Maybe as long as it takes to eat 3 chocolate bars. That's what I did while I was waiting." 3 chocolate bars, Miss Marple reflected, translated to approximately 8 to 10 minutes for a 7-year-old boy, rather longer than the 5 minutes Mr. Wexford had initially claimed. She excused herself from the children and made her way to where Joan was comforting Emma, who had finally succumbed to the effects of too many period-appropriate confections. Raymond stood nearby, looking rather helpless in the way men do when confronted with childhood digestive distress. Joan, dear, I wonder if you might help me with something. You were in the drawing room during Mr. Wexford's presentation, weren't you? Yes, though I was rather distracted by Emma's condition. Why do you ask? Did you happen to notice when Mr. Wexford left the room to fetch more sweets? Joan considered this carefully. I believe it was shortly after we'd entered. He'd just been explaining something about Victorian calling cards when he excused himself. Emma was feeling peaky, so I was focused on her rather than the time. And how long before he returned? Oh, quite a while actually. Long enough for me to debate taking Emma outside again. Raymond kept assuring me she'd feel better if she sat quietly, and he was right, thank goodness. Raymond nodded. I remember wondering if Mr. Wexford had gotten lost in his own house. It must have been at least 8 or 9 minutes. Miss Marple thanked them and continued her discreet investigation. She encountered Mrs. Sylvia Thornton from Magnolia Terrace, who was speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Gerald Pemberton from Ashwood House. It's absolutely dreadful, Mrs. Thornton was saying. Poor Patricia, though I must say she had been rather pointed in her questions this evening. Almost accusatory. Mr. Pemberton's expression was troubled. I noticed that as well. She seemed particularly interested in provenance documentation. Asked me several rather uncomfortable questions about my Georgian panelling. She questioned my stained glass, Mrs. Thornton admitted. Wanted to know if I had certificates of authenticity, as if I were running a museum rather than simply living in my family home. This exchange confirmed something Miss Marple had been suspecting. Dr. Ashbourne's research had not been making her popular with the historic homes tour participants. She filed this information away alongside her other observations. Inspector Slack emerged from the study looking decidedly grim. He approached Miss Marple with the expression of a man who had learned to respect, if not entirely welcome, her involvement in criminal matters. Miss Marple, I understand you were present during the priest hole demonstration. Did you observe anything unusual? Several things, Inspector, though their significance may not be immediately apparent. Dr. Ashbourne appeared quite startled by something she observed inside the priest hole. She emerged, clutching her research notebook, and seemed prepared to make some sort of accusation before being interrupted. An accusation against Mr. Wexford? I could not say with certainty, though she was looking directly at him when Mrs. Hartley distracted her. Inspector Slack made notes in his official notebook. We've been examining the priest hole more thoroughly. It appears Dr. Ashbourne's research notebook is missing. The only papers we found were some handwritten notes scattered beside her body, but they're too blood-stained to be legible. Her glasses were broken as well, Miss Marple added. I observed them when I first looked into the priest hole. The lenses were shattered, but the frames remained relatively intact, suggesting she was wearing them when struck. Reading something, perhaps? That would be my assumption. Something in the priest hole itself, something that required close examination with both torch and spectacles. The inspector's expression grew thoughtful. But what could possibly be in an empty priest hole that would require such scrutiny? Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and regarded him mildly. I think, Inspector, that you may find the priest hole was not quite as empty as it appeared. Chapter 5. Dust that tells a 400-year tale. The following morning brought crisp autumn sunshine to St. Mary Mead, though the cheerful weather seemed incongruous with the sombre mood pervading the village. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and after breakfast found herself once again at the Victorian rectory, where Inspector Slack had requested her presence. I've had forensics take samples of the dust from the priest hole, the inspector explained, leading her to the study. Dr. Haydock suggested it might prove significant, given your observations about Mr. Wexford's costume. And the results? Quite remarkable, actually. The dust in the priest hole is substantially older than the house itself, approximately 400 years old, consistent with Elizabethan construction. It contains specific pollen and mineral compositions that don't match any other part of the building. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, which suggests the priest hole was relocated from an earlier structure, not uncommon in the Victorian period, when there was considerable enthusiasm for acquiring architectural salvage. Precisely. But here's what's interesting. Mr. Wexford's trousers have dust that matches the priest hole exactly. He claims he's never actually entered it, only reached in to demonstrate the mechanism. Yet the dust on his knees suggests otherwise. Kneeling or crawling would be necessary to access the deeper recesses of such a confined space. They were interrupted by Sergeant Lake, who entered carrying several evidence bags. "Inspector, we've completed our inventory of Mr. Wexford's house clearance warehouse. I think you'll want to see this." The contents of the bags included several photographic documents showing various antique items: silver candlesticks, porcelain figurines, jewellery boxes, and small paintings. Each photograph was labelled with a case number and date. "These are from missing property reports filed over the past 5 years," Sergeant Lake explained. "Elderly clients whose estates Mr. Wexford cleared after their deaths. Family members reported valuable items missing, but nothing could be proved." Inspector Slack studied the photographs with growing interest. "And Mr. Wexford's warehouse?" "Contains items that match at least 7 of these descriptions. He claims they were legitimately acquired, but the documentation is conveniently absent." Miss Marple examined the photographs carefully. "Inspector, might I see the images of silver items in particular?" Among the photographs was one showing a collection of Victorian silver, including chamber candlesticks of varying designs. One in particular caught her attention, an ornate brass-based candlestick virtually identical to the murder weapon. "Reported missing from the estate of Mrs. Dorothy Fenimore," Sergeant Lake noted, "who died 8 months ago. Mr. Wexford cleared her house in Croxley." "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "that we may have discovered Dr. Ashbourne's fatal discovery. She entered the priest hole and recognised stolen items that she had catalogued during her historical research work. Several of her published articles concerned Victorian household inventories." Inspector Slack's expression showed dawning comprehension. "So she confronted Wexford about the stolen goods hidden in his priest hole. And he could not allow her to leave with that knowledge. Her research notebook would have contained detailed documentation of what she'd seen. Without it, proving his theft would be considerably more difficult." "But the notebook is missing," the inspector pointed out. "We found only those blood-stained fragments." "Which suggests Mr. Wexford removed it after killing her. Perhaps he even destroyed it." They conducted a thorough search of the rectory, paying particular attention to the kitchen, where Mr. Wexford had claimed to be fetching additional treats. In the refuse bin, beneath discarded food waste, Sergeant Lake discovered charred fragments of leather and paper. "The notebook," he announced triumphantly, "or what remains of it. He must have burned it in the kitchen range." However, Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to something else entirely: the bowl of Turkish delight that Mr. Wexford had been distributing to trick-or-treaters. She examined it carefully, then counted the remaining pieces. "Inspector, this bowl holds approximately 40 pieces of Turkish delight. If Mr. Wexford distributed one to each of the 40 tour participants, plus the seconds that some children requested, the bowl should be nearly empty." "Yet it's more than half full," Inspector Slack observed. "Indeed, which suggests Mr. Wexford's claim about fetching additional treats was false. The bowl was adequately stocked throughout the evening. His absence from the drawing room served an entirely different purpose." The evidence was mounting systematically, each piece adding to a picture of calculated murder. But Miss Marple knew that Inspector Slack would require something more conclusive to secure a conviction. Physical evidence was valuable, but a demonstration of guilt often proved more persuasive to juries. "Inspector," she said carefully, "I believe I know how we might conclusively prove Mr. Wexford's involvement, but it will require asking him to demonstrate something for us." Inspector Slack regarded her with that mixture of scepticism and respect she had come to recognise. "What sort of demonstration, Miss Marple?" "The priest hole mechanism, of course. I think you'll find that Mr. Wexford's familiarity with it is rather more extensive than he has admitted." Chapter 6. The mechanism betrays its master. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Slack had assembled all 5 historic homes tour homeowners at the Victorian rectory. Mrs. Daphne Hartley, Mr. Gerald Pemberton, Mrs. Sylvia Thornton, and Mrs. Beatrice Crawford from the 1920s bungalow joined Mr. Timothy Wexford in the drawing room, their expressions ranging from curious to apprehensive. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Slack began, "I've asked you here to assist with our investigation into Dr. Ashbourne's death. Specifically, I'd like each of you to demonstrate your home's special historical features, the elements you highlighted during last night's tour." Mrs. Hartley looked puzzled. I don't understand how that would help, Inspector. My cottage's inglenook fireplace is hardly relevant to what happened here. Nevertheless, I'd appreciate your cooperation. Miss Marple has suggested this approach, and I've learned to value her insights. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner chair, smiled mildly and continued her knitting. She had positioned herself where she could observe all participants clearly, her needles clicking with a steady rhythm that somehow emphasized the tension in the room. Mrs. Hartley went first, describing with practiced ease how the inglenook's bread oven functioned. Mr. Pemberton followed, explaining the Georgian manners false bookcase that concealed a wine cellar. Mrs. Thornton demonstrated how her Edwardian townhouse's servant call system operated, and Mrs. Crawford showed photographs of her 1920s bungalow's built-in cocktail cabinet. "Mr. Wexford," Inspector Slack said at last, "your turn. Please show us how the priest hole mechanism functions." Wexford had grown increasingly pale throughout the demonstrations. Now, faced with this direct request, he hesitated visibly. "Inspector, I'm not certain I can. After last night, the mechanism seems to be jammed. You saw yourself." "The mechanism has been repaired," Inspector Slack interrupted. "Sergeant Lake removed the coin that was lodged in it. I'd like you to operate it now, please." Wexford approached the bookshelf with obvious reluctance. His hand trembled slightly as he reached behind Fox's Book of Martyrs. For a long moment he appeared unable to locate the catch, his fingers fumbling among the leather-bound volumes. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily as she observed this pantomime of uncertainty. Then, apparently by accident, Wexford's hand found the mechanism. The panel swung inward with smooth efficiency. "There," he said with forced casualness. "As you can see, it works perfectly now." "Indeed it does," Inspector Slack agreed. "But I'm curious, Mr. Wexford. Last night, when we attempted to open the panel, you seemed completely flummoxed. You tried several times without success, yet just now, despite your initial hesitation, your hand went directly to the correct position behind the book. Lucky guess, I suppose." "I don't think so," Miss Marple interjected gently, setting down her knitting. "The human hand develops muscle memory through repetition. Your fingers knew precisely where to find that mechanism, because you've operated it countless times." "Of course I have. I demonstrate it during every tour." "But always from the outside?" Inspector Slack pressed. "You claimed you'd never actually entered the priest hole, yet your fingers moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the mechanism from both sides." Sergeant Lake produced a second evidence bag. "We found this wedged in the back corner of the priest hole this morning. A silver snuff box reported missing from the estate of Colonel Whitmore, whose house you cleared 3 years ago." Wexford's composure was crumbling. "I can explain. Can you also explain this?" Inspector Slack held up the reconstructed fragments of Dr. Ashbourne's research notebook. "Our forensics team has been working all night to preserve what they could from your kitchen range. Some pages survived sufficiently intact to read." He opened the scorched remnants carefully. "Dr. Ashbourne's notes from last night's tour. She documented finding several items in your priest hole that she recognized from missing property inventories. She specifically mentions a Victorian chamber candlestick matching one reported stolen from the Fenimore estate." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her voice remaining conversational. "The truly damning evidence, Mr. Wexford, is your demonstration just now. You claimed the mechanism was difficult to operate, that you'd never quite mastered it. Yet when asked to demonstrate it for Inspector Slack, you did so with barely a moment's hesitation. The real difficulty," she continued, "was that you jammed the mechanism yourself last night with a coin from your pocket. A 20-23 penny, fresh and bright, quite impossible to overlook. You needed the panel to remain closed long enough to rejoin the tour group and establish your alibi. But you'd used that mechanism so often, both entering and exiting the priest hole with your stolen goods, that operating it had become second nature. Your hands betrayed what your words tried to conceal." Wexford slumped into a chair, the fight draining from him. "She recognized the candlestick immediately, said she'd catalogued Mrs. Fenimore's silver collection herself and would be reporting me to the authorities. I couldn't let her ruin everything I'd built." Chapter 7. The Confession Beside the Hidden Chamber. The Victorian rectory study had grown quiet save for the ticking of an ornate mantel clock, and the soft scratch of Sergeant Lake's pencil as he recorded Mr. Wexford's statement. Miss Marple had returned to her knitting, but her attention remained focused on the confessing murderer. "I never meant to kill anyone," Wexford said, his voice hollow. "The business started innocently enough. I'd clear a house, find items that hadn't been specifically mentioned in wills or inventories, and set them aside. Most families never noticed. The elderly often accumulate possessions they've forgotten about." Inspector Slack's expression remained professionally neutral, but Dr. Ashbourne noticed. She was examining the priest hole, shining her torch around, and suddenly she went completely still. Then she started reading from that damned notebook of hers, matching items she saw with her research notes. She knew, Inspector. She knew everything. "So you followed her back into the priest hole?" Wexford nodded miserably. "I told her I needed to explain that she'd misunderstood. She went back in to look more closely at the candlestick. I couldn't think of anything else to do. The candlestick was in my hand, and then it was in hers, and then—" He broke off, his hands trembling. Miss Marple observed him with that particular mixture of compassion and clarity that characterized her understanding of human weakness. "The trick-or-treating children provided perfect cover," Miss Marple observed quietly. "With 40 people moving through your house, confusion about timing and location was inevitable. You counted on that confusion. I thought if I could just make it look like an accident, or perhaps that she'd been taken ill and collapsed in the priest hole." Wexford trailed off, recognizing how futile his planning now seemed. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. "After you killed Dr. Ashbourne, you took her research notebook, jammed the mechanism with a coin from your pocket, and returned to the drawing room where you'd left the tour group." "The Turkish Delight distribution," Miss Marple added, her needles clicking steadily. "You claimed to be fetching more sweets, but the bowl was already adequately supplied. That 8 to 10 minute absence gave you sufficient time to commit murder and attempt to conceal the evidence." Sergeant Lake looked up from his note-taking. "But why use a coin to jam the mechanism? Surely that would draw attention." "Panic, I think," Miss Marple replied gently. "Mr. Wexford needed to seal the priest hole quickly, and the coin was simply what came to hand. He probably intended to return later and remove it, making the jammed mechanism appear to be an unfortunate malfunction." Wexford nodded confirmation. "I was going to discover her body myself tomorrow morning, after I'd removed the coin and cleaned the scene more thoroughly. But people started asking about her almost immediately. Mrs. Hartley, then you, Miss Marple." "The dust on your costume was particularly revealing," Miss Marple continued. "Victorian gentleman's attire is not typically worn while crawling about in confined spaces. That 400-year-old dust on your knees could only have come from inside the priest hole, where you knelt beside Dr. Ashbourne's body." Mrs. Hartley, who had been listening with increasing horror, spoke up suddenly. "But Patricia's glasses, they were broken beside her body. She was reading something when you attacked her." "She was verifying her observations," Miss Marple explained, examining hallmarks on the silver, checking details against her notes. Dr. Ashbourne was thorough in her scholarship. She wouldn't make accusations without absolute certainty. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with decisive finality. "Timothy Wexford, I am arresting you for the murder of Dr. Patricia Ashbourne. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence." As Sergeant Lake administered the formal caution and prepared to escort Wexford to the police station, Mrs. Thornton voiced the question that seemed to be troubling all the assembled homeowners. "Inspector, what about our homes? Dr. Ashbourne was investigating all of us. Does this mean there will be further inquiries into our historical claims?" Inspector Slack's expression softened slightly. "That's not a police matter, Mrs. Thornton, though I imagine the Historical Society will want to conduct their own review, given Dr. Ashbourne's concerns." Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I suppose we should have been more forthcoming. My Georgian panelling is actually Victorian reproduction, rather well done, but not original. Patricia discovered documents proving it was installed in 1890, not 1750 as I'd claimed." "My stained glass is Edwardian, not Victorian," Mrs. Thornton admitted. Family law insisted otherwise, but Patricia found the manufacturer's records. "And my cottage timbers," Mrs. Hartley added quietly. "While genuinely Tudor, were moved from a barn in Oxfordshire in 1932, Patricia traced the building permits. Miss Marple regarded them with understanding. The desire to possess authentic history is deeply human. Dr. Ashbourne was perhaps overly zealous in her corrections, but her scholarship was sound. Too sound, Mr. Pemberton said bitterly. If she'd been less thorough, she might still be alive. If Mr. Wexford had been honest from the beginning, Miss Marple corrected gently, Dr. Ashbourne would still be alive. The fault lies not with the scholar who discovered wrongdoing, but with the criminal who committed it. Inspector Slack gestured to Sergeant Lake. Take Mr. Wexford to the station. I'll follow shortly. As Wexford was led away, his Victorian costume now seeming more pathetic than theatrical, Miss Marple began gathering her knitting supplies. Mrs. Crawford, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, approached her hesitantly. Miss Marple, how did you know? What made you suspect Mr. Wexford specifically? Several small things, Miss Marple replied, none conclusive in itself, but forming a pattern when considered together. The dust on his costume, the coin that could only have come from his pocket, the Turkish delight bowl that belied his absence. Most tellingly, his familiarity with the priest-hole mechanism, despite claiming difficulty operating it. But surely any of us might have killed her, Mrs. Crawford persisted. We all had motives. Our home's reputations were at stake. Ah, but only Mr. Wexford had something truly criminal to hide. Embellished historical claims might damage reputations and property values, but they're not illegal. Systematic theft from vulnerable clients most certainly is. Inspector Slack, who had been listening to this exchange, nodded agreement. Miss Marple's. Right. The items we found in Wexford's warehouse represent years of calculated theft. Dr. Ashbourne's murder was simply his most desperate act to preserve a criminal enterprise. Chapter 8. The research that died with its author. The following day brought a bittersweet coda to the tragedy of the historic Holmes Halloween tour. Miss Marple had been invited to Dr. Ashbourne's cottage by the deceased historian's sister, Mrs. Eleanor Ashbourne, who had travelled from Bath to settle her sister's affairs. The cottage was exactly what one might expect from a dedicated scholar. Every surface covered with books, papers, and research materials, meticulously organised into projects and time periods. Mrs. Ashbourne, a smaller, rounder version of her sister, moved through the rooms with obvious grief, but also with purpose. Patricia was difficult, she said frankly, preparing tea in the cramped kitchen, uncompromising in her scholarship, and often tactless in correcting others' errors. But she was honest, Miss Marple, scrupulously, painfully honest. Those qualities ultimately cost her life, Miss Marple observed gently. Yes, though I think she would have found a certain grim satisfaction in knowing her death exposed criminal behaviour. Mrs. Ashbourne set out the tea things with shaking hands. I've been going through her papers. Her research on the historic homes was nearly complete. What did she discover about the properties, if I may ask? Mrs. Ashbourne retrieved a thick manila folder from the study. Nothing scandalous regarding most of them. Mrs. Hartley's cottage timbers are indeed Tudor, though relocated. Mr. Pemberton's panelling is Victorian, but of excellent quality. Mrs. Thornton's stained glass is genuine arts and crafts work, just misdated. Mrs. Crawford's bungalow is authentically 1920s, with no embellishments. But Mr. Wexford's rectory? That's where things become interesting. Mrs. Ashbourne opened the folder to reveal photographs and detailed notes. The priest hole is genuine, Elizabethan construction removed from a manor house demolished in 1873. But Patricia discovered something else. The rectory itself was never actually used by clergy. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Indeed. It was built by a wealthy merchant who fancied himself a gentleman. He called it the rectory to give himself social standing, but no vicar ever lived there. Patricia found the original planning documents. So Mr. Wexford's historical claims were as false as his character. Precisely, but that's not what got Patricia killed. Mrs. Ashbourne turned to another section of the folder. These are her notes from the evening of the tour. She documented finding 12 specific items in the priest hole, all matching descriptions of property reported missing from estates Mr. Wexford had cleared. Miss Marple examined the list with careful attention. The Victorian chamber candlestick that became the murder weapon. Yes, along with Georgian silver, Edwardian jewellery, and various antiques spanning 3 decades. Patricia recognised several pieces from her work cataloguing estates for insurance purposes. She moonlighted doing that to supplement her historical society income, which gave her the expertise to identify stolen goods immediately. Mrs. Ashbourne nodded. "I've turned these notes over to Inspector Slack. He says they'll help recover property for the families Mr. Wexford defrauded." They sat in contemplative silence for a moment, sipping tea while autumn sunlight streamed through the cottage windows. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. "Your sister performed a valuable service, Mrs. Ashbourne, not only in preserving accurate historical records, but in exposing crime that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Small comfort to her now? Perhaps, but truth has its own value, independent of personal cost. Dr. Ashbourne understood that better than most." Mrs. Ashbourne's eyes had grown misty. She was planning to publish a book on St. Mary Mead's architectural history. 20 years of research. I suppose I should find someone to complete it. "I think that would honour her memory appropriately," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I might suggest ensuring the new author has rather better social skills than your sister possessed." This unexpected observation startled a watery laugh from Mrs. Ashbourne. Yes, Patricia could be rather direct. She once told the mayor that his supposedly 18th century desk was actually made in 1953, at his birthday celebration, in front of everyone. Truth-telling without tact, Miss Marple observed, is sometimes indistinguishable from cruelty, though in this case, Dr. Ashbourne's directness may have saved others from Mr. Wexford's thefts. As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, Mrs. Ashbourne retrieved one final item from her sister's desk, a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten entries. "Patricia kept this personal record separate from her research notes. I think you should read the final entry. It's dated the morning of the tour." Miss Marple accepted the journal and read the indicated passage aloud. "Have confirmed TW using Priest Hole for storage of stolen property. Must confront tonight during tour demonstration. Historical truth and legal justice both demand it. Evidence is incontrovertible." She knew confronting him was dangerous, Mrs. Ashbourne said quietly. She documented her suspicions in case something happened to her. A wise precaution that ultimately helped secure justice. Walking back through the village toward her own cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of Dr. Patricia Ashbourne. The historian had been difficult, uncompromising, and often socially inept. But she had also been honest, brave, and dedicated to truth in an era when convenient falsehoods were increasingly acceptable. Her death had exposed not only a murderer but also the small vanities and embellishments that even good people indulged in. The historic homes tour would continue, Miss Marple had learned, but with more modest claims and greater historical accuracy. Sometimes, she thought, tragedy could produce unexpected benefits. Chapter 9. Small Vanities and Larger Crimes. A week after Mr. Wexford's arrest, the St. Mary Mead Historical Society convened an emergency meeting to address the revelations surrounding the historic Homes Halloween tour. Miss Marple attended at the request of Mrs. Hartley, who had been elected temporary president following Dr. Ashbourne's death. The village hall was crowded with concerned residents, many of whom owned properties featured in various historical tours and publications. The atmosphere was charged with anxiety about what further discoveries might emerge from Dr. Ashbourne's research. Mrs. Hartley called the meeting to order with evident nervousness. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather under distressing circumstances. Dr. Ashbourne's death has shocked us all, but it has also raised important questions about historical accuracy and integrity in our community." Mr. Pemberton stood, his earlier pomposity replaced by genuine contrition. "I think we must begin with apologies. Many of us, myself included, have been guilty of, shall we say, embellishing our property's histories. Nothing criminal, but certainly not honest." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Mrs. Thornton rose next. "The Historical Society should establish clear standards for verification. We've been too willing to accept family traditions and anecdotal evidence instead of conducting proper research." "Patricia tried to tell us that," Mrs. Hartley said quietly. "But we found her corrections embarrassing and intrusive. We dismissed her concerns because they made us uncomfortable." Miss Marple, seated in the back row, observed these admissions with approval. Human nature, in her experience, rarely produced such honest self-reflection without prompting from tragedy. Inspector Slack, who had been invited to address the gathering, stood to provide an update on the criminal investigation. Mr. Wexford has confessed to systematic theft spanning 12 years. We've identified property from at least 23 estates that he cleared. Families are being contacted, and efforts are underway to return stolen items. What will happen to his house? Someone asked. The rectory will be sold to pay restitution to his victims. The priest hole will be properly documented and preserved, as it is genuinely historically significant. After the inspector concluded his remarks, Mrs. Crawford proposed a resolution. I move that the Historical Society commission a comprehensive, professionally researched survey of St. Mary Mead's historic properties. No more family legends or wishful thinking, only verified facts. The motion passed unanimously. As the meeting continued with discussions of implementation, Raymond approached Miss Marple with his children in tow. Aunt, Jane, the children wanted to thank you for solving Dr. Ashbourne's murder. They've been quite impressed by your detective work. Timothy Marple nodded enthusiastically. Will you teach me how to be a detective? I noticed things too, like Mr. Wexford being away from his candy bowl. You were very observant, Miss Marple praised. The key to detection is simply paying attention to what people do, not merely what they say. Emma, recovered from her candy-induced malaise, added, I feel bad that we were having fun trick-or-treating while someone was being murdered. That's not your fault, dear, Miss Marple assured her. Evil people exploit innocent activities to conceal their crimes. That doesn't make the activities themselves wrong. After the meeting concluded, Miss Marple found herself walking home with Dr. Haydock, who had attended to provide medical perspective on Dr. Ashbourne's death. Remarkable how you pieced it together, he observed. The dust on Wexford's costume might have been overlooked by anyone less observant. Small details often reveal large truths, Miss Marple replied. Mr. Wexford's entire criminal enterprise depended on people not paying close attention to details. Dr. Ashbourne's tragedy was that she paid attention to everything. Do you think the Historical Society will actually follow through on more rigorous research standards? For a while, certainly. Tragedy often produces temporary reformation. Whether it will endure... Miss Marple shrugged gently. Human vanity is remarkably persistent. People do enjoy believing their possessions are more special than they actually are. But surely not to the extent of criminal deception. No, most people's vanities are harmless. They inflate dates by a century or attribute furniture to famous makers without proof. Mr. Wexford's crimes were of an entirely different magnitude. They had reached Miss Marple's cottage gate. Dr. Haydock paused before continuing to his own home. I've been thinking about something you said during the investigation. You mentioned that Dr. Ashbourne wasn't killed to stop her exposé of historical inaccuracies, but because of what she discovered hidden in the priest hole. Yes, the other homeowners might have been embarrassed by her corrections, but embarrassment rarely leads to murder. Mr. Wexford faced prison, loss of livelihood, and complete social disgrace. His stakes were infinitely higher. Still, the timing troubles me. Why kill her during the tour with 40 witnesses present? Because that was when she discovered the evidence, Miss Marple explained patiently. Mr. Wexford couldn't predict that Dr. Ashbourne would recognize stolen property in his priest hole. Once she did, he had to act immediately before she could report him to authorities. The confusion created by trick-or-treating children proved advantageous to his scheme. Indeed, though ultimately, that same confusion helped expose him. Children's testimony about the candy, distribution gap combined with physical evidence established his opportunity conclusively. Dr. Haydock bid her good night and continued down the lane. Miss Marple entered her cottage and settled into her favourite chair with her knitting. The case was solved, justice would be served, and St. Mary Mead would eventually return to its usual rhythms. But she found herself thinking about Dr. Patricia Ashbourne, the difficult, uncompromising scholar who had died for discovering truth. The Historical Society would commission their professional survey, families would recover stolen property, and the village would take pride in more honest historical understanding. Small consolations, perhaps, but not meaningless ones. Chapter 10. The tour resumes with truthful tales. 1 month after the tragedy, the St. Mary Mead Historical Society organised a memorial historic homes tour in honour of Dr. Patricia Ashbourne. The event had been carefully redesigned to emphasise educational accuracy over Halloween theatrics, though some festive elements remained at the children's insistence. Miss Marple had been invited as a special guest, given her role in solving the murder and her own extensive knowledge of village history. She arrived at the starting point to find a considerably more subdued but no less enthusiastic gathering than the previous tour. Mrs. Hartley greeted participants with a brief speech. "Welcome to our memorial tour honouring Dr. Patricia Ashbourne. Tonight we celebrate honest historical scholarship and acknowledge that truth, however humbling, serves us better than comfortable fiction." The tour route had been modified. Honeysuckle Cottage, Ashwood House, Magnolia Terrace, and the 1920s bungalow remained, but the Victorian rectory had been replaced by the genuine 18th century vicarage, whose current occupant had graciously agreed to participate. At each stop, homeowners had prepared revised presentations, incorporating Dr. Ashbourne's research corrections. Mrs. Hartley acknowledged that her cottage's Tudor timbers were relocated, but emphasised their genuine age and craftsmanship. Mr. Pemberton highlighted the quality of his Victorian panelling, rather than falsely claiming Georgian origins. "Patricia taught us that authentic history is interesting enough without embellishment," he told the assembled group. "My house was built in 1847 by a prosperous merchant. That's a perfectly respectable pedigree." Mrs. Thornton displayed her research into the arts and crafts movement, properly dating her stained glass to 1906. "Edwardian craftsmanship was extraordinary. I'm proud to own genuine examples rather than Victorian pieces I'd falsely claimed." The most poignant moment came at Mrs. Crawford's 1920s bungalow, where a small memorial exhibition had been created. Dr. Ashbourne's research materials, carefully curated by her sister Eleanor, documented the social history of interwar suburban development. "My aunt lived in this house, when it was built," Mrs. Crawford explained. "Patricia helped me understand not just the architecture, but the lives of ordinary people who made these modern conveniences their homes. That's more meaningful than any false claim to aristocratic heritage." Raymond, attending again with Joan and the children, approached Miss Marple during the interval. "It's remarkable how the village has embraced more honest history." "Tragedy sometimes produces unexpected growth," Miss Marple observed, "though I suspect some romantic embellishment will creep back eventually. Human nature tends toward flattering narratives. Still, the professional survey the Historical Society commissioned should provide an accurate baseline. Indeed, Dr. Ashbourne's legacy will be a more truthful understanding of St. Mary Mead's past." Inspector Slack appeared briefly, checking on the event's security arrangements. He joined Miss Marple near the refreshment table. "Wexford's trial is scheduled for January," he informed her. "His confession means it should be straightforward, though his defence attorney is attempting to argue diminished responsibility." "Will that succeed?" "Unlikely. The premeditation was too clear. Burning Dr. Ashbourne's notebook, jamming the mechanism, rejoining the tour group to establish his alibi. All calculated actions." "What of the families he defrauded?" "Most property has been recovered and returned. Some items were already sold, but we're pursuing those buyers for restitution. The whole business will take years to resolve completely." As the evening concluded, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Eleanor Ashbourne, who had travelled from Bath specifically for the memorial tour. "Thank you for attending," Eleanor said warmly. "Patricia would have appreciated seeing her research used this way. Your sister left an important legacy. Honest scholarship always does. I've been thinking about her final entry in that journal, how she knew confronting Mr. Wexford was dangerous, but felt compelled to do it anyway. That was Patricia entirely. Truth mattered more than safety. A rare quality, and ultimately a fatal one, though I believe she would have made the same choice knowing the outcome." Eleanor nodded sadly. She used to say that historians were guardians of truth for future generations. That responsibility was sacred to her. They stood together watching the tour participants departing into the November evening, carrying with them a more honest understanding of their village's history. The festive lights, while still present, seemed to illuminate reality rather than fantasy. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said after a moment, I'm compiling Patricia's research for publication. Would you consider writing a foreword? Something about how her work led to justice?" "I would be honoured," Miss Marple replied, "though I think the focus should remain on Dr. Ashbourne's scholarship rather than the circumstances of her death. Her life's work deserves recognition independent of its tragic end." Walking home later, Miss Marple reflected on the resolution of the case. Mr. Wexford's arrest had been satisfying, but the larger victory was St. Mary Mead's embrace of historical honesty. Dr. Ashbourne's uncompromising standards, which had seemed harsh during her lifetime, now appeared prophetic. The Halloween home tour tragedy, as it would be remembered, had paradoxically strengthened the community it had traumatized. Property values had initially fallen as historical claims were corrected, but accurate documentation had ultimately proven more valuable than prestigious fiction. As Miss Marple settled into her chair with a final cup of tea, she considered writing to Raymond about the evening's events, but she decided instead to simply record her observations in her private journal. Some lessons were best learned through experience rather than instruction. The historic homes of St. Mary Mead would continue their tours, but now with truth rather than vanity as their foundation. Dr. Patricia Ashbourne had given her life for that truth, and the village had finally understood its value. A worthy memorial, Miss Marple thought, and one that would endure long after the specific details of murder had faded from immediate memory. Truth, she had learned over many years of observation, had a permanence that comfortable fiction could never match. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the shadows of St. Mary Mead. I'm William, and this has been Mindful Musings. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, may your mysteries be intriguing and your solutions satisfying. Good night.